Hi, everyone. I see that all of our attendees are starting to stream in now, so we'll give everybody a minute or so, and then we will go ahead and get started. So I just want to welcome you all to our Earth Month composting webinar. My name is Candace. I'm with the FIU Institute of Environment. So thank you for joining us. We have a lot in store for you guys in this 1 hour. We'll be talking about how to compost, some of the benefits of composting, and then going through a discussion with our panel of experts. So I just want to quickly introduce all of our speakers for today. We have Tracy Troxler from Sunshine Community Composting, Dr. Kara Rockwell, FIU ecologist and professor, Dr. Amir Kodamzadeh, FIU horticulturist and professor, Dr. Susan Jacobson, FIU professor and researcher, and one of our Institute student associates, Marie Trejos. So we're in for quite a fun webinar today, so thanks everybody. Before I get started, we are on Facebook Live. So for our Facebook Live attendees, if you are listening on Facebook, I would like to encourage you to register for the webinar and actually sign in through Zoom. We're going to have a few interactive elements, including polls and a Q&A session. So I just want to make sure that everybody who's watching is able to take part in those interactive elements. And then for those of you on Zoom, you should be able to see both our shared screen, which is our presentation and our PowerPoint, as well as the videos of our speakers. So hopefully that is working correctly. Okay, so now that we're done with all of the virtual housekeeping, I'd like to get us started. We are actually going to start off with a quality of life survey. So Marie, if you can please pull up the survey. This is just going to be a series of multiple choice questions, and Marie will go into explaining how that will work. So you should all see, hopefully, a box with the first quality of life poll on your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Candace. Hello, everyone. So now you should be able to see 6 questions here. Just to let you know, some of these are going to be multiple choice and other ones are going to be single response. So we'll go ahead and give you a couple of minutes for you to answer these. So the first question over here is just simply asking if you're a student or not. So go ahead and answer that question. I can start seeing who has responded. So we have about 48 participants at the moment. Oh, 57 participants. That's wonderful. So you can also type on the chat feature if you are having any difficulty perhaps seeing the poll, but you should start seeing the poll right now.
Just a quick point of clarification. So I don't actually think you guys can type on the chat. However, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A button that is on the bottom or the right hand side of your screen. So if you do have a question or if there's a problem, feel free to shoot us a Q&A question and we will answer the question for everybody so we can clarify some of those things.
So I see here that 0 attendees out of 48. Oh, wonderful. So I just got the first response. That's great. So the second one here. So the second question, it's pretty much asking you what type of business or where you work. So you should only choose one answer for this one. For the third question, it's asking you to identify the 3 most important things that determine your quality of life. So for this one, you can also select multiple answers. For the fourth one, it's also asking you for your top 3 concerns you have in regards to sea level rise and flooding. And for this one, you can also select multiple answers. And for the fifth question, we have your top 3 concerns when it comes to climate change other than sea level rise. And again, you can choose multiple answers. And for our 6th question, lastly, just please select your top 3 things that you think should be done to address climate change and improve your quality of life. Okay, we have about 17 people have responded out of 47. I'm just going to give you one more minute to go ahead and answer these questions. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll over here, and let's see how we did. Oh, I still keep getting answers. Okay. Just want to give you a couple more seconds then. Great. So let's go ahead and see how we did, or what we think. So now you should be able to see the responses of our audience. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for taking a look at these responses. And right now, I'd love to introduce you to Tracy Trexler with Sunshine Composting, so we can go ahead and get our presentation going. So go ahead, Tracy, you can unmute your mic now, and I will go ahead and prompt you to our slide.
Okay.
Thank you. Go on.
So I'm here to talk about composting as part of the solution. And to start us off, it's important for people to know what composting is. So composting is a decomposition of organic materials by microbes under oxygen-rich conditions. And you can see here on this slide, there's a decision tree to help you see that there are a variety of methods to look into and to help you decide what methods or systems you might want to try out. So we'll talk about more of these systems and methods as we get through the presentation. Next slide, please. I want to talk about the benefits of composting. And basically, when you choose to take your food scraps and put them into a composting process instead of wasting them in the landfill, you are helping create global benefits. And some of these benefits of composting are that it keeps food scraps out of our landfills, which are already overcrowded. And when organic materials like food scraps go into landfills, they create potent methane emissions that can contribute to climate change. Composting improves the health of soil life, reducing the need for fertilizers, which can contribute to imbalances in the watershed and lead to algae blooms. Composting improves the water holding capacity of soil, ultimately holding more nutrients and water in place. And it also brings attention to the challenge of food waste. So over 30% of food produced in the US is ending up in landfills, which a lot of people aren't aware of. While at the same time, we have millions of Americans who are in food insecure households. And then lastly, we want to talk about how composting can strengthen community relationships and improve our neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So an important benefit of composting is that it can help reduce the impacts of climate change. And there's a number of human activities that are affecting the whole Earth system, creating imbalances which are accelerating. And these are activities that increase the release of heat trapping gases into the atmosphere, which contribute to some conditions like ocean acidifying, sea levels rising, the intensity of storms and climate events, and also increasing heavy rainfall events. And you can see on the right here, we have a couple of charts. One is looking at the natural greenhouse effect, and one is a chart that reflects what happens when we have more human-enhanced activities that affect the greenhouse effect. And then at the bottom, we have a couple of charts that talk about the increase in CO2 and methane emissions that have happened over the last 70 years. Next slide, please. And so we can talk about methane emissions. And one of the benefits of taking action to compost is that it can reduce landfill-related methane emissions. And landfills are the third largest source of methane emissions in the US, according to the EPA, which is the result of having organic materials like food scraps mixed into the landfill and compacted and put into anaerobic processes, which release methane. And those can contribute to climate change. And a lot of people don't know how landfills work or where their landfill is or how much material is going into the landfill every day. And I really encourage people to take a tour of their local landfill or recycling facility to see firsthand how materials are processed and managed. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas emission, and we can do something about this by getting started with composting. Next slide. And altered nutrient cycles can happen as a result of human activity. So there's a lot of details in this slide about nutrient cycling, And there are a few points, main points that I want to draw your attention to, beginning with the fact that the creation of fertilizers through activities like phosphate mining disrupts natural nutrient cycling and can also create some toxic byproducts. And excess use of fertilizers, including nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, can result in runoff leaching into our waterways. And these sources come from agriculture, food production, industry, residential activities, and further disrupt the natural cycles. And this can harm biodiversity and create watershed pollution. So you see there's a couple of slides here that illustrate nutrient cycling. Where are nutrients coming from? Where are they going? And how are they impacting the whole system? And so when excess nutrients are running off of our farms and landscapes, along with other contaminants like uncontained pet manure, they flow into waterways and create conditions that can increase algae blooms. And we've experienced these, and these algae blooms can consume oxygen, block sunlight, create toxins, all of which can harm and kill aquatic life, and sometimes leading to dead zones. And these have significant environmental and economic impacts. So in a state where the health of the water is a major driver of our economy and a huge factor in the health and happiness of our residents, let's do what we can together to keep our waters clean. Because in Florida, it's quite often the case that what happens on the land is also happening in the water. Next slide. And this is community. So there can be a rich community building component to composting that people aren't always aware of. And this is one of my favorite parts about composting. So composting in your backyard or in a community drop-off site not only builds soil, but can contribute to garden and neighborhood greening projects. It creates opportunities for people to cross paths at the compost bins that may not have otherwise met. And we also see this in backyard composting, where people are working together as neighbors to compost, or having their friends compost with them, or they're composting by themselves and have leftover material and they bring it to a community gardening, enriching those connections. So there's an opportunity also for creating local green jobs, increasing access to local healthy food and education, and skill building right in people's neighborhoods and backyards. And the human factor is so important here. And you can see on the right, we see some photos of some smiling, gardening youth working together in the Opelika community. And then in the middle, we see, wait, go back real quick. We're gonna look at that food recovery hierarchy. So one thing that happens when people start composting is that they often become more aware of food waste, because the household wasting of food becomes measurable and it becomes personal. And as folks start collecting food scraps that we're not eating, they see that. And so we can use composting also as a way to focus people's attention on the challenges of food waste and the climate impacts of reducing food waste. So next slide. Okay. So there's a few community initiatives that we want to bring forward. And the Opelika Community Development Corporation is in partnership with Health in the Hood. And these are some groups that provide examples of these community benefits. So collectively, these groups have worked to combat food and health injustices, including food deserts through community gardening, nutrition, fitness education, and creating access to fresh food, jobs, and healthy lifestyle choices for families living on low incomes. And so these are some projects that are queuing up to start composting programs in the future. And basically, community members can bring food scraps that can be turned into soil amendment that can feed soil, which can feed people and create jobs and create an overall human community health benefit. And you can see their websites there. Next slide. And then the Sustainability Division of North Miami, it focuses on the city's environment, economy, and social equity, and their resilient NOMI initiative is inspiring residents to be stewards of sustainability. And then we have Back to Earth, and that's a local composting company started by a group of youth, siblings that focus on educating kids and families and provide community collection services. And their website's also there. Next. And then we have the Office of University Sustainability, along with the FIU Community and Agroecology Program, are helping maintain the Nature Preserve at MMC, where there's a composting site underway to begin collecting pre-consumer food scraps. And the BBC campus also would like to replicate this compost program. So we'll hear more about these programs in the Q&A section. But just so for students to know that there's a wide range of opportunities, whether volunteering, interning, fellowships in these programs that you can get involved in. And then here we start talking about transforming waste to resources. So we want people to know that when food scraps are not a waste, that they can be transformed into a soil amendment. And this is just the practical vision to help people start thinking, okay, instead of putting it in my garbage can, I'm gonna put my food scraps in a small bin in my kitchen. And I can store that kitchen bin under my sink, on my counter, in my fridge, in my freezer, in my garage. And then when it's full and you are ready to move it on, you can bring it to your backyard compost bin or then bring it to a drop-off site. So this is just some practical images of that going on. Next slide. And then here we have some examples of different kinds of systems. So you see some classic backyard bins, your vermicomposting, which is worm composting, and you see bokashi. And in the yard bins, basically when you set up the right profile of materials, the microbes migrate in or they're on the materials. And then in vermicomposting, you have to set up the system with worms as part of it. And they require some comfortable temperatures, so that's something you want to consider. And then bokashi is fermentation that can be done in these buckets, and you add a fermentation catalyzer as part of the process. Next slide. So that gives you some basic ideas to get started. And here's some examples of some do-it-yourself bins. So you don't have to go and purchase a fancy expensive bin. You could do it yourself. And so at the bottom here, you see a plastic storage bin that's used as a worm bin. And you see garbage cans that have been transformed into compost bins. And this one, this wire mesh at the bottom, that's one I really like to use. That's affordable and easy to make and very transportable. And so these just give you some ideas of other things that are out there, and there's a ton of stuff online. Next slide. Okay, and this slide, this is the one where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts and where people are going to end up having probably the most questions at the end of the presentation. In this slide, we're talking about the basic composting guidance for backyard and community scale aerobic processes. And so there's 4 main ingredients, and we mix these together to invite the presence of beneficial microbes that do the heavy lifting of composting. And so the first one is commonly called browns, and these are carbon sources which, such as dried leaves, mulch, shredded paper, shredded cardboard, fibrous materials that are commonly brown in color. And then the next ingredient is something that people often call greens, and that's your nitrogen source. And that's where our food scraps are coming in. They're going to be our nitrogen source, as well as you could use grass clippings, healthy garden debris, and in some systems, people might use this herbivore manure. It just depends on what you set up, but food scraps are a good place to start. And then moisture. So it's important that you have your materials evenly moist in your system and that you keep it at the moisture content that is like moist as a wrung out sponge. And then the fourth one is air. It's really important that you keep air in your bin. And so we like people to give them a turn and make sure that oxygen stays present. And then at the bottom, you can see when it comes to food scraps, there's some recommendations about which ones to use. And universally accepted are most fruit and vegetable scraps, peels, skins, shreds, pulp, frozen, canned, whatever. Grain-based materials, coffee grinds and tea, and then there's some other materials listed there. And then common materials that we typically keep out. And again, these depend on your system and what your drop-off site or what you want to do in your backyard, but we typically keep out animal products. We typically keep out dairy and fats and oils and grease, and then some other ones that are specific to our sites. So that's some of the nuts and bolts to get you started about the process. And then next. So we want to keep people thinking that instead of waste, that things are resources and they can be put back into the system or put back into the planet. And so we're focusing on the recycling basics here. And we want to make sure and just remind people that clean and dry aluminum cans and steel cans, plastic bottles and jugs, paper and cardboard can go into your curbside recycling bin and be transformed into a resource. And then listed below are some items that we want to keep out of the recycling stream. And then next slide. So an important message is that human-derived solutions can be addressed with human-derived problems can be addressed with human-derived solutions, and we can all be part of the solution. And so on the side here, we have some bullet points to just hit the highlights of what we talked about in this presentation. And we're really excited for everyone to take action. You can start with your next meal and be part of the solution. And so with that, I want to hand it over back to Marie.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This was extremely informative, and I'm really excited for everyone to have the opportunity to start also at home. And so now I would love to introduce you to Dr. Susan Jacobson. She's an FIU assistant professor who will demonstrate how we can track your compost, your recyclables, and your landfill materials using a smartphone application. So you can follow with us. You can grab your smartphone application if you have it handy. If you go to your camera settings and you just put your camera, focus it on the QR code that you see right now on the screen. There should be a pop-up tab that's going to pop up on your screen. So you want to click on that. That should lead you to the website that we have here below. So Susan, if you'd like to unmute your mic and maybe you can tell us how we can do this.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So there we go. So this is a composting monitoring app. It's developed by MESAN, which is the Miami Environmental Science Action Network at FIU, and you can reach it on your phone with a web browser at mesan.miami/monitor. The goal of this project is to better understand how people in Miami-Dade County are using composting. We're going to use this data to help citizens more easily integrate composting into their daily lives. So to use it, the first part here is the composting monitor, where you can enter information about your composting. So first, we're going to ask you to enter your name. You can use your own name or create a handle. We won't use your name in the data collection. We just want to make sure we have the data correct. Next, if you would enter your email, we won't contact you unless we have a question. Then we're going to ask you to enter the date that you are recording your compost. And tell us how many days worth of compost you are recording. Some people do their compost every week. Some people do it every few days. Okay, next, roughly enter your location. The map will probably show you where that is. If not, you can move the red dot. We're just trying to understand where in Miami people are composting, haha. Next, we're gonna ask you to enter either the weight or the estimated volume of your compost, or both. So in the instructions, and there's a link to the instructions at the top, we give you some tips on how to do this. There are a few ways to measure weight and volume. If you enter your measurement and volume, tell us how you determined your volume. There's a few different ways of doing that. And tell us the method of your compost. Are you doing the aerobic way, the way with the worms, the bokashi, or are you taking it to a compost center? And if you're taking it to a compost center, which center are you taking it to? Tell us which one. Finally, take a picture of your compost container. We want to see your container with the compost in it. That tells us a lot of information. And then finally, if there's anything else you want to tell us, you can enter it at the bottom of the screen and then press the submit button. And then your data will be sent on to us. So this is the compost monitor. We also have one for recycling and landfill, if you're into those, monitoring your resource management. And then we also have some instructions. Okay, thank you, Marie.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, and so here I'm going to show you an easy way that you can record this data onto the application. So here is just a picture of my household landfill, a picture of my composting browns, my recyclables, and my family compost. So what we like to do, so here the way that I'm recording volume, if you can use this online calculator, which is super easy. The way that you would calculate for a rectangular container, it would be just multiply your length times width times height, and just make sure that you insert your measurements there. If you have loose materials, then you can use a measuring cup that you may have as well. And then oftentimes you find in your trash bags, in the bottom, it tells you like the gallons. So if you're filling up a whole entire bag, then you could just put how many bags and then the gallons. And then for weight, is super simple as well. Some of you may have a kitchen It's a scale basically where you can put your weight and measure that. But you can also use the bathroom scales, which you can, you know, you get on it and then you record your weight, and then you get on it as well. But then this time you use it with your container and your bag. So here I'm just going to do a simple subtraction, and then I can identify quickly my weight. So it's pretty simple. Like Susan said, these are instructions that you're going to be able to find in the website in the instructions tab. All right, and so over here we also have, right before we begin our panel, we would like to ask you just a few more questions. And so you're going to be, I'm going to go ahead and prompt 5 questions here. They're very quickly, we can go through them. So let me go ahead and get this one starting. And these are going to be about learning outcomes. We want to see right now your understanding right before we get into the panel. So you should now see about, 5 questions. So the first one is asking, what activity contributes to the 3rd largest source of methane in the United States? So go ahead and insert your answer here. I'm going to give you a couple seconds, or like about a minute or 2 to answer these. The second question says, how can composting reduce the impact of global change? And this one's going to be a multiple choice question. So you can select a couple answers here. And remember, there's no right, wrong answer here. We just want to see how you're doing. And your results won't be shared with anyone. So no worries. So, oops, just moved to a different slide. Okay, so let's scroll down to the 3rd. What are some of the additional benefits of community composting? So go ahead and select a few here. Thank you, I see great responses. Okay, and number 4, do you plan to try to implement one of the activities you learned about today and record the reporting or report it into our smartphone application? Okay, just gonna give you about 30 seconds, but I think we're. Wow. Okay. All right, let's see how we're doing. Okay, so yes, some of you are answering some of the right questions over here, so this is great. All right. All right, Candace, would you like to prompt us to our wonderful panelists?
Yes, thanks, Marie. So just before I get started with the panel, we did get a question in the Q&A. And remember, you all are welcome to ask questions in that Q&A session, in that little box. We will do an open question session after we ask some questions to the panel. But we did get a question asking if we will share the slides with attendees. We do plan on making the presentation public after the fact. So if you do want the presentation, we're also recording the webinar. So if you are interested in sharing this with somebody later, you will definitely be able to find that on our website later. Okay, so I would now like to introduce our 3 expert panelists. So you've met Tracy Troxler from Sunshine Community Composting. We also have FIU professor and ecologist Dr. Kara Rockwell, and also Dr. Amira Kodamzadeh, horticulturist with FIU. So I would actually like to start off by asking you all to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what got you into the world of composting. Maybe Tracy, will start with you. I think you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm the founder of Sunshine Community Compost, and we're a nonprofit organization that creates education and action programs to increase community composting initiatives in Florida. We like to be hands-on and in the community and with people around composting. And basically, I got into composting because I was a backyard composter, and then I became a master composter, and then I started composting on farms, and then I started realizing the community possibilities and how it's connected to so many different things. So I started doing pilot projects around community initiatives, and then I ended up doing a training in large-scale compost operations just to understand the whole scale. That's pretty much how we got going. And we just saw that there's a soil challenge and a food waste challenge, and we wanted to put those two things together. And that's where community composting comes in. And I just really like the community scale because it enriches the human and environmental interconnections that I think are really important to bring to the surface.
Yeah, definitely. Kara, if you'd like to.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I have had experience with composting, just, as an observer starting and, also a participant when I was a kid, the typical, I child of the 70s, grew up with parents who had like, the typical, like kind of a hippie, back to earth, just a outdoor composting system where everything was piled into a pile. Like you had pumpkin growing out of it because all the seeds would sprout. And it worked really well. This was in North Florida. And, kind of coming back to it since moving to Miami, one of my primary research partners, the Education Fund, which is established food forest systems. These are the closed permaculture systems, multi-storied home gardens with trees, lots of different layers in the Miami-Dade County public school system. And there are banana circles, other types of composting systems in these gardens. And although I study trees, for me, always some of the most interesting stuff that goes on in a garden is happening below ground. And so that's how I've kind of gotten back into it. And it's, of course I have a composting bin in my own backyard, and that's been a great experience as well.
Awesome. Amir?
Good afternoon, everybody. Although I cannot your faces, but welcome to this webinar. Well, as mentioned briefly in the presentation, we do have an agroecology program, and also there is an organic garden on campus. In the past years, we've been involved with I was very much involved with the composting projects that we had, and I always saw the students. So well, technically there is no day that I don't receive a call from the community or from the students that very drop off the compost. And it's very interesting that, the students are very much interested on composting. So we did actually have a 3-stage composting, which we made it with the cinder blocks. It was a very, easy thing. And right now, this effort is being led by Office of Sustainability and Connie Caldwell and other colleagues and the students. Which we hopefully have a 3-stage composting bin in nature preserve and organic garden, which we can definitely engage more students in the community with that.
Great. Yeah, it's great for us to have some composting options readily available for us on campus and throughout the community, definitely. So it also seems like there's a ton of information out there about composting. What are some of the common misperceptions that people may have about composting? Tracy, I'll have you start us on that one.
Okay. Yeah, we get a lot of questions when we're out there doing presentations and stuff. And commonly people are thinking, oh, composting is going to smell bad, and that's typically only in an improperly managed system. Composting can be a really wonderful process to be part of. And some people think only gardeners can compost, or that you need a garden to compost. You just have to be someone who wants to return nutrients back into the planet and not see them go into landfills. And even in the backyards, people are worried, am I going to make too much? And it's, it just keeps reintegrating into the landscape. And some people think, oh, I need the sun to warm it up. And there's all these interesting, wonderful microbial processes happening in the bin. So most of the heat's coming from the inside out. And then other people are thinking, oh, it's going to attract a lot of flies and it's going to be awful. And really healthy managed systems yes, we're in Florida and we have bugs, but you shouldn't be experiencing those kind of things. And even in your kitchen, if you're collecting your kitchen scraps during the week, If you keep a lid on it, you shouldn't have too many issues. I mean, I never do, and most of our people never do, or they wouldn't participate. So those are a few, and you don't have to compost alone. Composting is all about community. It's about microbial community, it's about human community, and connecting those two things. So there's lots of ways to interconnect using compost as a platform.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are a few.
Yeah. Kara, Amir, do you all have any misperceptions you came across?
Well, there is one thing that I want to add, and is that many people think that, well, they always say that, I mean, I don't need it. That's why I don't want to compost, because I don't need it. But honestly speaking, those people are buying a lot more soil from Home Depot and other places. And if they really, and definitely that's the soil that they're buying is not with the same quality as a compost could be, because you're talking about organic, material that you can easily add to your soil without any issue. So, and one more thing I want to add is that some people think that it takes a lot of time for them, and it requires a lot of effort, which is not like that. So technically you need to, check it out once or twice a week, the most, and maybe add a little bit of water, and that's it. I mean, there is nothing else that you really need to do for this process. So,
yeah.
Yeah, and I was just going to add as well, it's a surprise. I mean, just try it out for a week. If you're not completely convinced, just give it a shot and see how much of your trash, the amount of trash that you typically put in the trash bin goes down. Because guaranteed, like I would say almost half of when I started doing this since moving to Miami, it's even more than half of our waste is organic. And then when you start including all of the paper products that can be included in your composting bin or system, it's really remarkable how much less trash you'll start putting out. Because the trash trucks come here about twice a week, and it's really, I mean, it could probably go down to once a week and we'd be fine, because that's how much we've reduced our waste by doing this. So it is something that I think in terms of environmental responsibility that everybody should think about engaging in this.
Great. Yeah, so don't be afraid to start composting. At least start it, try it, and see how it works for you. But it seems like it's a pretty flexible system. So I actually want to dig a little bit deeper into what it takes to create compost. So I have a two-part question. The first part is, what are the basic ingredients, if you will, that go into composting? And maybe Amir, you can start us off for that one. I think you might be muted.
yeah,
There you go. That's okay.
So I called it boom. So for you guys to always remember. So the first thing is definitely you need the bacteria to facilitate this.
Oh. Seems like you might be cutting in and out. Maybe we lost you. So I'm gonna punt the question over to Kara or Tracy, and then when Amir gets back on, maybe he can add some answers to what you all are gonna say.
Tracy, I don't know if you want to take this one. I can add my, because I can speak about an experience of my own, just in terms of being a backyard composter, and just some of the other things I've seen with some of the other groups that I know of who do this. Like I said, you could do it the way my parents did it back in the 70s, where you just have the big pile of compost. That's complicated in the urban areas, just because, and we'll get into this, discussion about pests. We have a lot of pests that can get into it. And I think one of the question and answer questions I saw in there was about raccoons. That is one of the species that'll go after like your compost if it's not protected. You can invest and buy it on Amazon, for example. Everything's on Amazon. A compost bin. You can, going back to one of those great slides that Tracy had, having chicken wire in some way of encaging all of that compost. That's a great way to do it as well. But and also we'll get back to this whole point. making sure that the chicken wire, there is screening that you can buy that's small enough that'll keep out rats. And we can go into that discussion later, and how big that actually, or how small that actually has to be. And I would say also a really key piece of equipment for me is a pitchfork. If you're doing a bigger bin, just because you're gonna have to aerate it. And that's good just to get it like all mixed in and like make sure that it gets all aerated, you know, between the layers. And so that has been one of the key elements for me in having that. It's one of those tools that you need.
Yeah. Amir, so I see that you're back online.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
I think we need to, yeah, those are the things that I think are going to have more for us when we have everything online these days. Anyways, so I was telling you guys that, I mean, I called it BOOM. So the first thing that I would definitely want to talk about is bacteria, and without bacterial activity, we are not going to have healthy compost. The second thing is organic matter. And the ratio, which is the most important question that many people are asking of the brown and green material is, I mean, there are many recommendations, but the best thing is there's something between 20 to 30 of brown and one portion of green materials. And the third O is oxygen, which definitely is really crucial. And the last thing is M, with moisture content. So I think if we have these four, definitely those are the four basic ingredients that we want to have. So Maria talked about the volume of the and how you can weigh, but I think this is really kind of challenging for some of the people who want to compost. So the easy way to understand the carbon and nitrogen is to have, like, if just assume that you have 5 gallon. Well, this is the volume that we're going to use. So we need to have 5 gallon of green materials and 1 5 gallon of brown materials in order to have a right combination of the carbon and nitrogen. And the people might ask, how come we have more gallons of green material, brown materials? Because if you talk about, if you ever hold a brown material in your hand, you definitely know that it's going to be heavier than definitely the green material. So that's why you need the 2 buckets of materials, which is a source of nitrogen, and 1 gallon, 5 gallon of brown materials in order to have a right combinations of like 30 to 1 carbon nitrogen ratio.
So the second part of this question was actually to see if there's any specific recommendations that you guys have when it comes to tools or equipment to use when you're starting off composting. We actually have an attendee question asking if you may be able to recommend any compost bins that are more do-it-yourself and that don't require putting compost in plastic bins. So any responses to that? Maybe we'll start with you, Tracy.
The do-it-yourself ones, yeah. The hardware cloth, those are really easy to assemble, and you can expand or retract it based on the volume of material that you're trying to process. We've also, I mean, ultimately, I think it's great to use repurposed materials that in and of themselves are compostable. Although some people want them to last a long time, but we've built some wooden bins that are stackable that you can move so that when one bin is full and ready to be cured, you can move the other bin over. So there's a lot of designs online that can help you with this kind of like the wooden bins that are really helpful, and you can, making 3-bin systems too. And then Amir mentioned using even cinder blocks. Depending on where you're located and what kind of access to wildlife is there and what space you have, it always depends. Really, the answer always depends on a couple of factors. But those are a few things that you could easily get started and not have to use plastic. So I understand that concern.
Great. Kara, do you have any additions to maybe some equipment or some great tools that I know you were saying somebody was saying they usually use a pitchfork that you need. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just my bias from being an outdoor composter. I mean, for those who are going to be doing this indoors, you know, it's similar concept, but there's some other tools that you can purchase or create. You know, the Bokashi bucket for one. I mean, that's one that I have not done, and you know, there's a lot of great information online about that. And Tracy had a slide up about that. And that's essentially, you know, where you have, I think it's commonly they use fermented bran, like for the microbes to you know, digest all of this organic material. And that's an interesting one because you can put in that container what you typically can't put in an outdoor composting bin. Like you only put, you know, vegetable, paper, fruit waste, but you can also put meat and dairy in the Bokashi bin. And so that one, I think, you know, Tracy, correct me if, you know, this is wrong. I think you can create this yourself with a bucket that has to be sealable, right? And you just leave the waste in there with the microbe, like that ferments for about a week. And then you can put that in your yard, you know, acinomus. You can also create, and I had one of these when I lived in a smaller place. You can put it in, somebody was mentioning about putting this underneath their sink. You know, this is just like a vermicomposting system where you actually have red wiggler worms, which are great composting worms. And somebody had asked a question about that as well. Will those get loose in the yard? We can go back to that later. But that's also something, and you know, typically people use plastic bins to do this. And somebody had mentioned on that Q&A, like, doesn't it seem, you know, it goes against what you think about environmental sustainability to buy plastic. You know, there's some other options, I think, for doing that, but it's generally a smaller container that is sealable as well, because you don't want to attract, you know, cockroaches. Somebody had also asked about that, and we can talk more about it. But typically those are sealable, and you can do that yourself for sure and create something that's more amenable to an indoor situation, but everything is possible.
Yep. So speaking of an indoor situation, lots of people are worried about starting up a composting site or a composting bin in their home if they live in an apartment or in a smaller space that is not, you know, doesn't have access to the outdoors or things like that. So how can you tell us a little bit about how somebody might be able to accommodate apartment living and still be able to compost? Maybe Kara, will start with you there.
Yeah, I'll just add a few more things onto what I was already discussing. Like I said, it is possible. Of course, you can decide on how big or how small you want to keep this. A lot of people, and I think, you know, there was a good discussion. You can find information about this online when in New York started, I think they made a move as a city to start collecting all the compostable material. And so people were actually collecting that. Not necessarily composting it in their apartments. But of course, you know, it was a good discussion point. Like, you know, does it make sense to have, you know, keep all of this organic material in your kitchen in a small apartment? Won't that attract, you know, pests? But it is possible to do it. Like I said, vermicomposting is a really popular one to do. You can do that on not just inside underneath your sink. You can do that on a terrace. That's really nice to do. But as Tracy mentioned, that you have to keep it in a cool environment because those worms, and especially important in Florida, you don't want to put your vermicomposting system on a veranda, on a terrace where it's going to get like very strong light, right? You have to keep it cool. I mean, I've done it before and I was uncertain about doing it in Florida. Of course, ours is outdoors, but you just keep it in a nice, cool spot and it should be fine. But the Bokashi system is another one that's really great. And you can, you know, make that yourself. I think there are kits that you can purchase online. You just have to make sure that you get the fermenting tea, so to speak, that'll actually pickle all of your compost, right? And it takes about a week to do it. And that's really, I think it sounds really disgusting. I know, but it's very efficient. I have not heard anybody complaining about smells. I mean, between those two systems that I know of that are the best for indoor composting, and Amir or Tracy, you can add on to this, that neither one seems to have a very strong smell. Why? Because on the one hand, you have the Bokashi system that's just it's sealed, it's pickling the stuff that's inside of there. So it's not, when you take it out, you can see that it's organic material, but it's been kind of leached of its vitality. Essentially pickles. I mean, you're looking at our pickles. And then on the other hand, you have the vermicomposting system where you have worms that are constantly working and you have to add enough carbon-rich brown materials, of course, because that's what, if it's starting to smell, add more of those. But those worms are really efficient in getting all of that organic matter processed. And so you don't have as much of a smell as if you like just had a container of you know, produce that's just hanging out on your counter that isn't being processed by anything. But people who have issues with this in terms of like the smell issue, the vermin issue, I think a majority of people probably leave just vegetable organic waste in their trash can overnight, right? That's empty, that's not sealed, that is just open. And the most active, you know, the period high peak of activity for cockroaches, for example, is at night. And for sure, they're going to be getting into your trash can. So people who have complaints about that, try to think about the smell. Think about the what you typically do compared to this idea of having sealable composting systems in your apartment. And there is a big difference. I think, you know, it actually reduces the number of pest problems that you might actually already have.
So we just put up the composting process slide just in case, you know, as we're talking about some of this, you all can see visually what feeding your soil looks like, what the compost recipe so-called looks like on there. And a question we're getting from one of our attendees was whether there's a list of food drop-off locations in Miami-Dade County. So we're gonna go ahead and try and put some of those resources together for you all. We'll list those on our website when we put up the recording, as well as the slides, so that it's easily accessible for everybody. So definitely, you know, when you're in a small apartment, it's good to know that you can still compost. And as you all have mentioned and touched on, one of the concerns is that there are pests that might be present because of the composting. And even when you're composting outdoors, that may be even a bigger issue. So some people are bringing up concerns about raccoons or rodents, roaches. So how can somebody really mitigate this issue with composting? Tracy, do you want to go ahead and start us off?
Yes, how to mitigate for roaches and
rodents and pests, any sort of pest.
Okay. Yeah. There's a couple of quick things that I always recommend. First is that people always want to put their compost bin in the back of the yard, like way back there. And then what ends up happening is people then don't go there as often. And having a steady human presence will discourage animals from habitating, coming in, hanging around. That's like the first one. So I always bring the compost bin close to the back door and make it a place you want to go, right? It shouldn't smell, so it should be a place you want to go. That's one. And then enclosing your system obviously is really important. And then what else do I recommend? Those two are really big. We have our compost bins in the middle of the city parks, and we don't have any issues with any of this kind of stuff. So we have to acknowledge that in tight urban areas, there's going to be rodents and some creatures and that kind of thing. But if you have a close human presence, you keep the system shut down. And then also if you have more, like you take out a bucket that's more raw, you know, it's been sitting in your kitchen maybe 2 weeks instead of 1, I would bury that in the middle, put it in the middle. And then once it starts digesting and you turn it, and you can equalize the moisture, and that'll also discourage creatures and that from poking around. So you just have to stay active with it. And if you see that you have some roaches coming in, it's time to start turning and staying a little bit more in close contact with your system.
We're also, so some of our attendees are letting us know too that if you freeze your compost, it seems like that's a good way to no longer have fruit fly issues or odor and things like that. Kara, Amir, do either of you have any recommendations for reducing pests for compost?
Well, I just want to add that we cannot leave any oil, and that's one thing that it's always would increase the definitely the pests, and definitely meat. Because I think someone brought up in Q&A that they have a raccoon problem and other things. So definitely we don't want to add any sort of meat or anything like that in the compost. So and as Tracy mentioned, the time is all you know, sometimes an issue. Sometimes we keep it for a long period of time. Or without any aeration, or without any water, additional water. So those are the things that, you know, definitely can attract more pests.
Yeah.
I was just going to add really quickly too. Of course, you know, we have our limits to what we want in our houses. I mean, definitely we don't want cockroaches or rats. But I was going to mention that when you have a compost pile outside, and whenever students ask, when we talk about the intrinsic value of species, and they're like, well, what's the intrinsic value? Why are cockroaches so important, right? They're natural decomposers, right? You want them actually in your compost pile. And I think that's the ick factor of composting that, you know, I think most people who have a compost pile, they're already like, they have kind of made that leap, and that's not going to be as big of an issue. But when you open up a compost pile, there's a lot going on in there. Like I said, some of the below ground activities in a garden, some of the most cool, it's the coolest stuff that's going on out there. And part of that is you're going to have species in there. And there are a lot of great native Florida cockroach species that we do want in the backyard. They are part of the decomposition process. So that is important to keep in mind. We don't want to keep those guys out. There are other things that you don't want in there. And that's what was said, the rats. And I have, you know, I had a period where I had stopped for a while because the palm rats, these are the rats that climb around in the trees. They're really common in Miami. They often get into the compost pile if you don't have it sealed. And that's why I was saying, like, if you have one of those ones you've done it yourself, do it yourself type compost bins with the screen, you want to make sure that screen, in my opinion, is about 1/4 inch. And that seems pretty small, but anything a rat can get its head through, it's going to be able to get its whole body in. So you want to make sure if that's the case, if you want to try to keep rats out, you have a rat issue. Because if you give them more food, they're already like pretty good at, like, you know, repopulating the environment. You don't want to give them an extra motivation, and keep it sealed on top, but on the sides it does need to aerate. I would suggest as small as 1/4 inch, just because they 1/2 inch they'll be able to get into for sure. They're not, their heads are fairly small.
Yeah, good to know. So we are getting a couple of questions about vermiculture and using worms in your composting. Somebody in the Q&A is asking whether, they say they have a few vermiculture bins that are working well. If they transfer these to a larger yard compost system, will the red wiggler worms stay in the compost or spread into their yard vegetation? They're worried about how this might impact the overall land that their composting is on. So maybe, I know Kara, you had mentioned something about this in one of your previous questions. Maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, and I know that's something that people do bring up. And I think one of the reasons that happens, the red wiggler worms, they are not native to here. I have not heard of them being a problem or getting out of hand. Don't, you know, that evidence I haven't seen. If it's out there, you know, please, you know, spread the word. But I don't think that's an issue. I think that there is, and Tracy or Amir, if you can add on top of this, my understanding that sometimes the red wiggler worms, like those are the most common ones that are used in vermicomposting. Sometimes there is an Asian jumping worm that is passed off as a red wiggler worm, and that one can be invasive. So you want to make sure that you get your red wiggler worms from a good source. And there are a lot of different ones online. Uncle Jim's Worm Farm is one of the more popular ones, and they have a really good success rate. I've known a couple of farmers here in Miami, well, down in Homestead, who have used red wiggler worms and have never had an issue with it getting out of hand. So as far as I know, that they are not problematic, you know, in the long run.
Yeah, great.
So I guess, I mean, if you want to just release them to your backyard, the biggest issue that you might have is that those worms will die because they're very sensitive to the heat. And that's why in the vermicomposting, it's always in the shade, or if you want to do it indoor, they love the room temperature. So that's one thing that I think is not feasible in our climate in South Florida.
Good to know. Yep. So another one of the questions that we're getting, and this is a question we've gotten a few times, is how do you, hold on, sorry, one second, how long do you have to wait before you can start using your compost as like fertilizer and things like that? So this is a question we've gotten several times, so I know a lot of people are interested in this. Maybe Tracy, if you want to go ahead and.
Sure. It does depend on your process. For us in our community bins, we don't return compost back to people for about 3 or 4 months because we like it to be really well cured. If you are doing a backyard bin and the bottom is cured and the top is still active, you know, in the backyard bins, typically they aren't as highly managed as like the community systems. So it could be anywhere from 6 to 12 months. A lot of the people that we work with that are doing backyard compost have 2 bins. One is active so that you're not putting actively composting materials back into the landscape. And one, it has been curing. So you have 2 separate bins. So it just depends on your method. Kind of the throw and go method could take, you know, 12 months before you get compost. If you're contributing it to a community site and they're managing it, it's a hot compost process, you can get it much quicker. But like I said, for us, we like it to be nice and cured, you know, 3 or 4 months before we give it back to people.
Yep. Okay. So another question from our attendees. In the images of the composting bins, I guess that we have in PowerPoint, it looks like many of them are raised off the ground. Is there a reason for that? Do they have to be raised off the ground like that?
They do not. A lot of the bins we use have the bottom cut out of them so that the natural biology can get into the system. It just depends. Some of these probably have holes cut into them, and some of it might be for an aesthetic purpose. But yeah, it's good to have contact depending on how close you are to a water source. But some people, they want to see more what's going on there, or they want to be able to move the system. There's a lot of different reasons, yeah, but having contact is also perfectly acceptable and helpful.
Yeah, great. So I kind of want to bring it back to Earth Day for 1 second. I know we're running a little bit over, but as everybody knows, Earth Day was last week, and the theme for Earth Day and Earth Month was climate action, which relates back to our Sustainability Development Goals with the UN. So I have a quick question about this. As we're aware about Earth Day and all of this, and composting is a great way to close the loop when it comes to our food systems, and it was mentioned in the PowerPoint that it has an impact on addressing climate change. How are we being in line with these Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to composting? And maybe Amir, you can start us off.
Yeah, sure. So this is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which came out in 2016. And as many of you have seen this before, there are 17 goals to transform our world to a better place. And as you see, there are different priorities. The first one is no poverty, and then the second one is zero hunger. So all of those goals are directly or indirectly tied to the composting and recycling. But the goal number 2, zero hunger, and the goal number 12, which is responsible consumption and production, are very tied to the composting. As you know, 15 million people are globally and over 2 billion people are actually expected to be undernourished by 2050. And there is no other way that we can technically give them enough food, or better to say healthy food, organic food, other than community gardening. And the most important component of the community gardening is the soil, and not any type of soil, the healthy soil, which is composting. So if we consider all those things, when Tracy was talking about climate change in the beginning of the presentation, we can see that all those things are tied to each other, and composting would be a very main component of reducing the definitely gas emission. And you talked about landfill and all that too. So goal number 2, zero hunger, and definitely goal number 12 are the ones that are very tied to the composting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it seems like there are a lot of places where composting is doing a lot of good, definitely. So for one of our last questions, and I don't see too many more questions coming in from our audience, but one of our last questions is, I'd like to know if you all could explain maybe how somebody might be able to get involved in a community initiative when it comes to composting. I know there are a few local initiatives we kind of touched in on the PowerPoint presentation, as well as some campus initiatives. But if you can touch on that, and then maybe also talk about how to approach, one of our questions from our audience is how to approach potential implications with getting the right ratios when it comes to things being collected through the community, and how some of those logistics would work. So we'll start with you, Tracy, since I think you had mentioned some of these in the PowerPoint.
So how can people get involved in community initiatives? I say start some community initiatives, right? Get a bin and start inviting people. There are a lot of community composting initiatives happening around the US. There's a whole network of community composters. There's an organization called Institute for Local Self-Reliance that connects all these different community composters. So these initiatives are happening everywhere, and you can start one, or we see initiatives happening at schools where we have schools are the community. We see initiatives happening in someone's business where someone decides to spearhead the effort and people at that business can bring their scraps. So we're seeing people, you know, they have bicycles and they're picking up buckets at people's front doors and, you know, bringing it to a community garden, keeping it really local. You know, there's different regulations about solid waste and movement of solid waste and hauling and all these different things at a larger scale. But, you know, at community scale, people can just start working together and then see what's possible. You know, we can create soil together. So that's how we got started. We just started connecting people and connecting food scraps.
Great. Amir, do you want to touch on the agroecology program? Yep.
Sure. So, well, what Tracy mentioned mostly was the community part of the question. I know I've seen the number of the people, the attendees. We had 50% of students and 50% from the community. So Tracy mentioned a lot of those resources that the community can have access to. But at FIU for the students, right now we do have some issues having the community at our organic garden and in some of the facilities that we have at FIU. But this is a facility for the students that we have at FIU Organic Garden and through Office of Sustainability in Nature Preserve. And Kara can add to that too, but there are a lot of student clubs at FIU, including Garden Club, that the Garden Club actually is very active in composting, in planting the produce, and then we have also a farmers market at FIU, which is in the breezeway of the library every Wednesday. So if you ever pass by there, just stop by and buy some great soaps and vegetables and all that, and support the students' activities. But yeah, I mean, those are the definitely initiatives that we already have in place for FIU students. For example, Garden Club is offering many different workshops every week. So you just need to, follow those things in Instagram, or, be a part of the FIU Garden Club, which is in OrgSync and Panther Connect network, and receive those information that we have. We had workshops on vermicomposting. We had workshops on many different things, which we are bringing the community to give a lecture and talk and hands-on workshops to the students. So those are definitely resources that the students can use.
Great. And those workshops, are those open to the community, or are they student?
They are not. They are open to all the FIU students because, as I mentioned, I mean, there are some limitations of having the community at the same time that we offer the workshops for the students or we have the class. But it doesn't mean that we cannot have a workshop for the community at a separate time, because the FIU Organic Garden is the people's garden. And if you go to the FIU Agroecology webpage, there are a lot of information about the people's garden, which has been recognized by the USDA. So those are definitely places that we can have a community, but maybe not at the same time, that we are offering a workshop for the students through the Garden Club or as a part of the classes. But definitely there's a possibility of having the community.
Great. And somebody was asking about Facebook groups that can help people compost, or where people may be able to get support or encouragement. I know that Sunshine Community Composting is on Facebook. The Institute of Environment is as well. And I believe the College of Arts, Sciences and Education, as well as some of the other resources through FIU. So you can definitely search those groups on Facebook and any of those, we'll be happy to answer any questions.
And also FIU Agroecology and FIU Organic Garden, they're all in Facebook too.
Great. Great. So unless any of our panelists have any additional comments, I'll open it up to you all for any of your additional comments. Otherwise, we can move on. Do Tracy, Kara, Amir, do you all have anything?
It looked like there was one question. Did we answer that about the largest size cardboard piece? That was, yeah, that was one that somebody had asked about that. And I would just recommend, just from my own experience, and Amir and Tracy, feel free to add on. You don't want to, you want to make sure that that is not a huge piece, because the smaller it is, the less time it'll take to decompose, right? So you want to try to rip that up a little bit, just because it makes it easier for the organisms in there to get at it and decompose it, would be my recommendation.
Okay, well, thank you so much, panelists. I am going to just have one last thing for our attendees. We have one last poll question for you all. So Marie will pull up that last question for you. If you guys could please answer that question for us. And otherwise, we really appreciate everybody joining us. There's the question. Please feel free to answer. I believe you can only pick one answer to that one. But we really appreciate you all joining us for this. You know, if you have any additional questions, feel free to visit our website. It's environment.fiu.edu. And you can also email us at environment@fiu.edu, and we'll be happy to field those questions to our experts, get you any additional answers that you might need. And hopefully this is a great start to a new hobby for everybody on this webinar. Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll keep the poll up for another minute, and then we'll close it once we see that it's been, I think everybody may have voted. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thanks, Candace.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.